Welcome, friend, to this peaceful hour where we gently peel back the layers of time. Tonight our story takes place in a world far removed from ours, but still tenderly human. Whether you're drifting off or just looking to slow the pace of your evening, I'm grateful you're here. Before we descend into the blood-soaked sands of the Colosseum, I'd love to know where you're joining me from tonight. Are you settling in after a long day, perhaps with a warm cup of tea? Or are you on the other side of the world greeting the morning sun? Drop a comment below and let me know what time it is in your corner of the world. And if you find yourself drawn to these dark chapters of human history, that subscribe button will ensure you never miss our journeys into the past. Now close your eyes for a moment and imagine the roar of 50,000 spectators echoing off marble walls. Imagine the metallic scent of blood mixing with incense and sweat. Imagine being a man whose profession was dying well in front of a crowd that thirsted for your blood. This was the reality for thousands of souls in ancient Rome, where death was not just entertainment, it was industry. When we think of gladiators today, Hollywood has painted them as heroic figures, noble warriors fighting for freedom and glory. But the truth is far more complex and infinitely more tragic. These men, and yes, some women too, existed in a world where every sunrise could herald their final day, where every meal might be their last, where every relationship was shadowed by the knowledge that tomorrow they might die for the amusement of strangers. The gladiatorial games were not born from Roman cruelty alone, though cruelty certainly fed them. They emerged from an ancient Etruscan funeral rite, a belief that blood spilled in honor of the dead would appease the spirits and ensure safe passage to the afterlife. What began as solemn religious ceremony gradually transformed into something far more sinister, a spectacle that would define Roman entertainment for over 6 centuries. In the beginning, these contests were intimate affairs, held in the courtyards of wealthy families to honor their deceased patriarchs. Picture a small gathering, perhaps 20 or 30 mourners, watching 2 or 3 warriors clash in ritualistic combat. The fights were brief, the deaths meaningful, the ceremony sacred. But Rome was a civilization that never met an institution it couldn't expand, corrupt, and monetize. As Rome grew from a collection of hilltop villages into the master of the Mediterranean, so too did its appetite for spectacle. What had once been sacred became secular. What had once been intimate became industrial. The private courtyards gave way to purpose-built amphitheaters. The handful of mourners became tens of thousands of spectators. And the sacred ritual became a blood-soaked business. By the 1st century of the Common Era, gladiatorial combat had evolved into a sophisticated entertainment industry that would make modern promoters weep with envy. Every aspect was calculated, from the types of fighters to the weapons they carried, from the elaborate opening ceremonies to the carefully choreographed methods of execution. Nothing was left to chance except, ironically, who would live and who would die. The men who entered this world came from every corner of the empire and every level of society, though most arrived in chains. Prisoners of war formed the largest group. Germanic tribesmen captured in the endless frontier conflicts, Celtic warriors taken in the conquest of Gaul, rebels from Judea and North Africa who had dared to defy Roman rule. These men had already lost everything, their homelands, their families, their freedom. All that remained was to lose their lives as entertainingly as possible. But war captives were not the only source of gladiatorial flesh. Criminals condemned to death found themselves facing a choice that was no choice at all: immediate execution or the slim possibility of earning their freedom in the arena. For a man facing crucifixion or being thrown to wild beasts, the gladiator schools must have seemed like salvation, even if that salvation came wrapped in a death sentence. Perhaps most tragic of all were the volunteers, free Roman citizens who sold themselves into gladiatorial slavery. Some were driven by crushing debt, others by the desperate hunger that stalked the poor in Rome's crowded tenements. A few were seduced by the promise of glory and the adoration of the crowds. They signed contracts written in blood, quite literally, pledging their bodies to the games. This was their job description. Once a man entered the gladiatorial system, his old life ceased to exist. He was given a new name, often reflecting his place of origin or his fighting style. These names stripped away their individual identities, reducing them to ethnic stereotypes for the entertainment of the crowd. The gladiator schools, or ludi, were part military barracks, part prison, part training facility. The largest and most famous was the Ludus Magnus in Rome, connected to the Colosseum by an underground tunnel so that the gladiators could be moved to the arena without the public seeing them beforehand. The mystique had to be maintained after all. Life in the schools was regimented with military precision. The gladiators rose before dawn for training that would make modern special forces weep. They practiced with wooden swords against wooden posts, building the muscle memory that might keep them alive for one more fight. They learned to move in heavy armor, to fight with different weapon combinations, to read their opponent's tells and weaknesses. The training was overseen by former gladiators who had somehow survived long enough to retire, men whose bodies bore the scars of 100 battles and whose eyes held the hollow look of those who had seen too much death. These trainers, called magistri, were both saviors and tormentors. They might keep a man alive through superior training, or they might work him to death in preparation for fights he would never survive. The gladiators were fed well, better than most of the Roman poor. They needed strength for the arena after all, and a malnourished fighter was poor entertainment. But this good food came with chains, both literal and metaphorical. They slept in cells barely large enough for a man to lie down, locked away each night like the valuable property they had become. Medical care was surprisingly sophisticated. The gladiator schools employed some of the best physicians in the empire, men who had learned anatomy from treating wounds that would have killed ordinary patients. These doctors could set bones, stitch cuts, and treat infections with a skill born of necessity. A gladiator who could be healed was an investment worth preserving. But perhaps the cruelest aspect of gladiatorial life was not the physical hardships, but the psychological torture of uncertainty. A gladiator never knew when he would fight, against whom, or with what weapons. He might go months without entering the arena, training endlessly for a battle that never came, only to be thrust into combat with a day's notice against an opponent he had never seen. The weapons and fighting styles were as varied as the men who wielded them. The retiarius fought with a net and trident, his strategy based on entanglement and quick strikes. He wore minimal armor, relying on speed and agility to avoid the crushing blows of more heavily armed opponents. Watching a retiarius fight was like watching a deadly dance, all fluid motion and precise timing. The secutor was the retiarius's traditional opponent, armed with a large rectangular shield, a gladius sword, and a helmet that completely enclosed his head, except for 2 small eye holes. The secutor was built for endurance and protection, designed to outlast the more agile net fighter in a battle of attrition. The murmillo carried the distinctive curved rectangular shield and was armed with a gladius. His helmet was topped with a fish crest, and he was often pitted against the thraex, who fought with a smaller square shield and a curved sword called a sica. These matchups were carefully designed to create compelling drama, each fighting style having advantages and disadvantages that would create uncertainty about the outcome. The Dimachurus fought with 2 swords, a style that required incredible skill and coordination. The Laquearius used a lasso as his primary weapon, attempting to rope his opponent like a cowboy in some deadly rodeo. The Sagittarius was an archer, though bow-armed gladiators were relatively rare since archery was considered less honorable in close combat. Each weapon combination required years of training to master. A gladiator might spend a decade learning the intricacies of his fighting style, only to die in his first real combat when nerves or bad luck overcame skill and preparation. The schools contained men who were artists of violence, practitioners of a deadly craft that demanded perfection because anything less meant death. The gladiators developed their own culture within the schools, a brotherhood forged in shared suffering and the constant presence of death. They formed intimate relationships, knowing that their friends might be ordered to kill them in the arena. Some gladiators refused to fight their close companions, choosing death over betrayal. Others compartmentalized their emotions, becoming killing machines who could slaughter their best friend in the morning and mourn him in the evening. Romance bloomed even in these dark places. Gladiators formed relationships with each other and with the women who worked in the schools, the cooks, the seamstresses, the occasional female gladiator. These relationships were intense and desperate, love affairs conducted in the shadow of death. Children were sometimes born to these unions, though they too became property of the gladiator school, destined for the arena if they were boys or slavery if they were girls. Religion provided some comfort in this world of constant death. Many gladiators adopted the mystery religions that promised life after death, particularly the cult of Mithras, which was popular among soldiers and appealed to men who faced death regularly. They made offerings to the gods before fights, praying for victory or at least an honorable death. Some carried amulets or tattooed protective symbols on their bodies, any talisman that might tip the scales in their favor. The night before a fight was the longest night in a gladiator's life. Some men spent it in prayer, others in frantic training, still others in whatever pleasure they could find. The gladiator schools provided women for those who could afford them, wine for those who wanted to dull their senses, and quiet corners for those who preferred solitude. Some wrote letters they would never send, to families they would never see again. The morning of the games brought a ritual as old as the gladiatorial tradition itself. The fighters were given a final meal, often elaborate and expensive, a last taste of life's pleasures. They were bathed and oiled, their bodies prepared like sacrifices. Their weapons were inspected and blessed, their armor fitted with ceremonial care. The procession to the arena was a spectacle in itself. The gladiators marched through Rome's streets in elaborate costumes, their weapons gleaming in the sunlight, musicians playing martial music to announce their coming. The crowd would gather to watch them pass, pointing out favorites, placing bets, treating the condemned men like celebrities on their way to a movie premiere that might be their last. Inside the Colosseum, the atmosphere was electric with bloodlust and anticipation. 50,000 spectators created a wall of sound that could be heard for miles. The emperor sat in his box, the ultimate judge of life and death. Senators and wealthy merchants occupied the best seats, while the common people packed the upper levels, all united in their hunger for violence. The games began with elaborate ceremonies, processions of exotic animals, displays of wealth and power, designed to demonstrate Rome's dominion over the world. Musicians played, priests offered sacrifices, and officials made speeches that no one really listened to. But all of this was just preamble to the main event, the moment when men would die for the entertainment of the crowd. These words, spoken by men who knew they might not live to see another sunset, have echoed through history as perhaps the most chilling greeting ever uttered. The fights themselves were not the crude hack-and-slash affairs that Hollywood often portrays. They were sophisticated displays of martial skill, choreographed to create maximum drama and suspense. The gladiators were valuable investments, and killing them too quickly was poor economics. A good fight might last an hour or more, with multiple pauses for the fighters to rest, receive medical attention, or change weapons. The crowd was not merely passive observers, but active participants in the drama. They cheered for their favorites, booed the cowards, and ultimately held the power of life and death through their reactions. When a gladiator fell, wounded but not dead, the crowd would signal their judgment. Thumbs up meant life, thumbs down meant death, though historians debate the exact gestures used. The emperor made the final decision, but he rarely went against the will of the crowd. A gladiator who had fought bravely, even in defeat, might be spared to fight another day. One who had shown cowardice or fought poorly would likely face the death stroke. The victor would place his foot on his opponent's chest and wait for the signal. If death was decreed, he would drive his sword between his opponent's ribs and into his heart, a quick end to a life spent in service to Rome's hunger for blood. Not every fight ended in death. Many gladiators survived multiple combats, building reputations and fan followings that could eventually lead to freedom. The most successful gladiators became celebrities, their names known throughout the empire. They received gifts from admirers, marriage proposals from wealthy women, and endorsement deals from merchants who wanted to associate their products with famous fighters. But fame was a double-edged sword in the arena. Popular gladiators were often matched against each other in fights that were guaranteed to end in the death of a crowd favorite. The promoters knew that these tragic matchups drew the largest audiences and commanded the highest prices. A gladiator's success often signed his death warrant. The psychological toll of this existence cannot be overstated. These men lived with the constant knowledge that their death was not just possible, but probable, that their lives existed solely for the entertainment of others. Some gladiators broke under this pressure, refusing to fight and choosing immediate execution over prolonged suffering. Others found a kind of peace in their fate, embracing their role as instruments of death and dying with a dignity that moved even their bloodthirsty audiences. The most famous gladiator revolt in history was led by Spartacus in 73 BCE, a Thracian warrior who escaped from a gladiator school and gathered an army of fellow slaves and gladiators. For 2 years, this slave army defeated Roman legions and terrorized the Italian countryside, proving that the men forced to die for entertainment were capable of much more than their masters had imagined. Spartacus and his followers were eventually defeated and crucified along the Appian Way, their bodies left to rot as a warning to other potential rebels. But their rebellion had shaken Rome to its core, demonstrating that even the most oppressed people could rise up when pushed beyond endurance. The gladiatorial system continued, but it never again seemed as secure or as natural as it had before Spartacus showed that slaves could defeat their masters. The daily reality for most gladiators was far removed from such grand gestures of defiance. They lived quiet lives of desperate hope, training endlessly for fights that might never come, forming relationships that could be severed by the whim of a promoter, dreaming of freedom while preparing for death. They developed their own slang, their own customs, their own ways of finding meaning in a meaningless existence. Some gladiators found purpose in mentoring younger fighters, passing on the skills and knowledge that might keep the next generation alive a little longer. Others lost themselves in philosophy or religion, seeking answers to questions about fate, justice, and the nature of human suffering. A few simply accepted their lot and tried to make each day count, finding small pleasures in good food, friendship, and the satisfaction of mastering their deadly craft. The gladiatorial schools were microcosms of Roman society, complete with their own hierarchies, politics, and social structures. Veteran gladiators commanded respect from newcomers. Successful fighters received better treatment than failures. And even within this world of slaves and condemned men, some found ways to accumulate wealth and influence. The lanista, the owner of a gladiator school, was often a former gladiator himself, a man who had fought his way to freedom and then built a business on the backs of men in the same position he had once occupied. These men understood the psychology of their fighters better than anyone, knowing exactly how much hope to provide, how much fear to instill, and how much comfort to allow. The relationship between gladiator and lanista was complex and often contradictory. The lanista needed his fighters to be skilled and motivated, but not so much that they would rebel or try to escape. He provided them with good food, medical care, and even luxuries like wine and women, but always within the context of their enslavement. It was a careful balance between carrot and stick, comfort and control. Training in the gladiator schools was not limited to combat skills. The fighters learned to perform, to play to the crowd, to understand that their survival depended not just on their ability to fight, but on their ability to entertain. They practiced dramatic gestures, learned to milk applause, and studied the psychology of crowds. A gladiator who could make the audience love him had a much better chance of receiving mercy when he was defeated. The gladiators also learned to die well, a skill that was perhaps more important than learning to kill. A man who faced death with courage and dignity could win the respect of the crowd even in defeat, while a coward who begged for mercy would likely be shown none. The Roman concept of honor demanded that a man meet his fate without flinching, and gladiators who embodied this ideal became heroes even in death. The weapons used in gladiatorial combat were works of art as much as instruments of death. The finest smiths in the empire crafted swords, shields, and armor specifically for the arena, creating pieces that were both functional and beautiful. A gladiator's equipment was often worth more than most Romans earned in a year, and losing or damaging it could result in severe punishment. The different fighting styles were not just random variations, but carefully designed systems that created compelling matchups. The heavily armored secutor was slow but nearly invulnerable to most attacks, while the lightly armed retiarios was fast but vulnerable to a single solid blow. The Thraex, with his curved sword and small shield, was a middle ground between offense and defense, capable of adapting to different opponents and situations. These fighting styles were often associated with different regions of the empire, playing into Roman stereotypes about foreign peoples. The Gallic gladiators were seen as fierce but undisciplined, the Germanic fighters as strong but stupid, the Eastern gladiators as quick but cowardly. These ethnic characterizations added another layer of drama to the fights, allowing the audience to cheer for or against entire peoples through their gladiatorial representatives. The medical care provided to gladiators was surprisingly advanced for its time. Gladiator school physicians developed techniques for treating wounds that would not be seen again until modern times. They understood the importance of cleanliness in preventing infection, used sophisticated surgical tools, and even performed early forms of plastic surgery to repair facial injuries that might make a gladiator less appealing to crowds. These doctors kept detailed records of injuries and treatments, creating the first systematic studies of sports medicine. They knew which injuries were likely to be fatal, which could be treated successfully, and how long recovery would take. This knowledge was valuable not just for treating gladiators, but for understanding human anatomy and physiology in general. The psychological support provided to gladiators was less sophisticated, but no less important. The schools employed priests, philosophers, and even entertainers to help maintain morale among the fighters. These men understood that a gladiator's mental state was just as important as his physical condition, and they worked to keep the fighters focused and motivated despite the hopelessness of their situation. Religion played a crucial role in gladiatorial life, providing both comfort and explanation for their suffering. Many gladiators adopted fatalistic philosophies that helped them accept their lot, while others found strength in beliefs that promised reward in the afterlife for earthly suffering. The cult of Mithras was particularly popular among gladiators, with its emphasis on courage, loyalty, and the triumph of light over darkness. The gladiators developed their own superstitions and rituals around combat. Some would only fight with weapons that had been blessed by specific priests. Others insisted on wearing particular amulets or performing certain ceremonies before entering the arena. These rituals provided psychological comfort and a sense of control in a situation where they had very little actual power over their fate. The relationship between gladiators and the Roman public was complex and contradictory. The same people who cheered for a gladiator's death would also worship him as a hero if he survived long enough to become famous. Gladiators were simultaneously the lowest members of society and its greatest celebrities, despised for their status as slaves, but admired for their courage and skill. Women in particular seemed drawn to gladiators, despite or perhaps because of their dangerous lifestyle. Wealthy Roman matrons would pay enormous sums for the sexual services of famous fighters, and some even divorced their husbands to run away with gladiators. This fascination with dangerous men was seen as a symptom of Roman moral decay by conservative commentators, but it persisted throughout the gladiatorial era. The gladiatorial games were expensive to produce, requiring enormous investments in facilities, equipment, and personnel. A single day of games could cost more than some cities spent in a year, and the pressure to provide increasingly elaborate spectacles led to financial ruin for many would-be promoters. Only the wealthiest Romans could afford to sponsor major gladiatorial events, and even they often went into debt to pay for them. The economics of gladiatorial combat created a complex web of relationships between promoters, trainers, gladiators, and spectators. Successful gladiators could command appearance fees that rivaled those of modern sports stars, while promising newcomers were bought and sold like any other commodity. Betting on gladiatorial contests was enormous business, with some Romans wagering their entire fortunes on the outcome of a single fight. The gladiatorial system also created employment for thousands of people who never set foot in the arena. Trainers, doctors, weaponsmiths, armor makers, animal handlers, musicians, and countless others made their living from the games. Entire industries developed around gladiatorial combat, making it an integral part of the Roman economy. The decline of gladiatorial combat was gradual and complex, involving changes in Roman religion, economics, and social values. The rise of Christianity played a role, as the new religion's emphasis on the sanctity of human life conflicted with the casual slaughter of the arena. Economic factors were also important, as the cost of maintaining the gladiatorial system became increasingly difficult to justify as the empire faced financial crises. The last recorded gladiatorial games were held in the early 5th century CE, more than 6 centuries after the first contests honouring Etruscan dead. By then, the Roman Empire itself was crumbling, and the elaborate infrastructure that had supported the games was no longer sustainable. The great amphitheatres fell into ruin, their stones carted away to build churches and houses for a new age. But the memory of the gladiators lived on, embedded in human consciousness, as symbols of both human cruelty and human courage. These men who faced death daily for the entertainment of others became legends, their names and stories passed down through generations that could barely imagine the world in which they lived and died. Today, as we look back on the gladiatorial games from the comfort of our modern world, it's easy to condemn them as barbaric relics of a less civilized time. But perhaps we should also remember that these men, forced into an impossible situation, often face their fate with a dignity and courage that would be admirable in any age. They remind us that even in the darkest circumstances, human beings can find ways to maintain their humanity and honor. The gladiators who walked into the arena knowing they might not walk out again teach us something profound about the human condition. They show us that people can adapt to almost any circumstance, find meaning in the most meaningless situations, and maintain hope even when hope seems impossible. Their story is ultimately not just about ancient Rome, but about the resilience of the human spirit in the face of overwhelming adversity. As we close this exploration of their world, perhaps we should spare a thought for these forgotten warriors who died so long ago for the entertainment of crowds that have themselves been dust for 15 centuries. They lived each day knowing it could be their last, and in doing so, they perhaps understood something about the preciousness of life that we, in our comfortable modern existence, sometimes forget. The gladiators faced death daily, not by choice, but by force. Yet many of them did so with a grace and courage that has echoed through the ages. Their legacy reminds us that every day is a gift, every moment precious, and every act of courage meaningful, no matter how small or forgotten it might seem. Yet even as we witness the incredible courage and resilience of these warriors, we must confront a darker truth that lurked beneath the surface of every gladiatorial contest. The economic machinery that drove these spectacles was vast and unforgiving, a complex web of greed and exploitation that stretched far beyond the arena walls. The gladiator schools, or ludi, were not just training facilities, but profitable enterprises that operated with ruthless efficiency. Wealthy investors and lanistas, the gladiator trainers who owned these schools, calculated the value of human life with the cold precision of merchants weighing gold. A novice gladiator might cost the equivalent of a year's wages for a common labourer, while a seasoned veteran could command prices that rivaled the finest racehorses or prized bulls. These entrepreneurs understood that death was not just an occupational hazard, but a fundamental component of their business model. Every gladiator represented a significant investment in training, equipment, medical care, and accommodation. Yet the very nature of their profession meant that this investment could be lost in a single afternoon, in the span of a few brutal minutes under the scorching Roman sun. Consider the financial calculations that weighed on the mind of every lanista as he watched his gladiators enter the arena. A single murmillo, trained for 3 years and equipped with the finest armor and weapons, might represent an investment of 50,000 sestertii. His death would not only eliminate this capital, but also rob the school of future earnings from his appearances. Yet if he lived too long without suffering injury or defeat, audiences might grow bored with his predictable victories, reducing his market value and the prices spectators would pay to see him fight. This created a perverse economic incentive where moderate danger and occasional casualties were actually optimal for business. The lanista needed his gladiators to survive long enough to recoup their training costs and generate profit, but not so long that they became stale entertainment. Death had to remain a genuine possibility, visceral and immediate, or the crowds would lose interest and seek their thrills elsewhere. The gladiators themselves were acutely aware of their position as living commodities in this brutal marketplace. They knew that their trainers viewed them not as human beings with hopes and fears, but as investments that needed to yield returns. This knowledge created a psychological burden that was perhaps even heavier than the physical dangers they faced. They were forced to live with the constant awareness that their worth was measured solely in their ability to kill and survive, to bleed and endure for the entertainment of others. The most successful gladiators developed a complex relationship with this commodification of their existence. Some, like the legendary Spartacus, eventually rebelled against it entirely, choosing to risk everything in a desperate bid for freedom rather than continue as property in the gladiatorial machine. Others found ways to work within the system, leveraging their popularity and skill to negotiate better conditions, finer equipment, or the possibility of eventual manumission. But for the vast majority, there was no escape from the fundamental reality that they were expendable assets in someone else's business venture. Their daily training was designed not just to keep them alive, but to make them more valuable as entertainment. Every technique they mastered, every scar they earned, every victory they achieved only served to increase their market price and extend their usefulness to their owners. The crowd's bloodlust was carefully cultivated and maintained by this economic system. Promoters understood that spectators needed to believe they were witnessing genuine mortal combat, not choreographed entertainment. This meant that real deaths had to occur with sufficient frequency to maintain credibility, even though each death represented a significant financial loss. The challenge was finding the optimal balance between authentic danger and business sustainability. The Gladiators' equipment itself reflected these economic considerations. While their armor and weapons were often elaborate and expensive, they were designed as much for spectacle as for protection. A gladiator's helmet might feature intricate engravings and precious metal inlays that served no defensive purpose, but added to the visual drama of combat. Their shields bore colorful designs that helped spectators distinguish between fighters and identify their favorites, turning each man into a branded commodity. Even the medical care provided to gladiators was calculated with profit in mind. The finest physicians were employed at the major schools, not out of compassion, but because healthy gladiators were more valuable than injured ones. These doctors developed sophisticated techniques for treating wounds and injuries, innovations that would later benefit Roman medicine as a whole. Yet, their primary concern was always returning their patients to fighting condition as quickly as possible, regardless of the long-term consequences to their health and well-being. The psychological toll of existing within this system cannot be overstated. Gladiators were forced to form bonds of friendship and brotherhood with men they might be required to kill in the arena. They shared meals, training, and quarters with individuals who could become their opponents in a matter of days or weeks. This created an emotional strain that few modern minds can truly comprehend. Many gladiators developed rituals and coping mechanisms to deal with this psychological burden. Some turned to religion, finding solace in the worship of gods who they believed might protect them or grant them courage in battle. Others embraced a fatalistic philosophy, accepting that death was inevitable and focusing on achieving glory and honor in whatever time remained to them. Still, others found comfort in the bonds of their gladiatorial brotherhood, creating surrogate families within the schools that provided emotional support in their darkest hours. The trainers and owners of these schools were not necessarily cruel men, though many certainly were. Some genuinely cared for their gladiators and mourned their deaths. But even the most benevolent lanista was trapped within an economic system that demanded a steady supply of violence and death. They could provide better food, finer accommodations, and more humane training methods, but they could not eliminate the fundamental reality that their business model depended on men killing and dying for public entertainment. This economic dimension of gladiatorial combat reveals perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the entire institution. It was not simply a matter of barbarian bloodlust or primitive entertainment, but a sophisticated and highly organized industry that treated human life as a commodity to be bought, sold, and consumed. The gladiators were not just warriors facing death in combat, but products in a marketplace where their value was determined by their ability to die dramatically and memorably. The spectators who filled the amphitheaters were not merely passive observers, but active participants in this economic system. Their ticket purchases funded the entire enterprise. Their cheers and jeers influenced which gladiators lived or died, and their loyalty to particular fighters determined market values and career trajectories. They were consumers of human suffering, and their appetite for blood was carefully cultivated and fed by an industry that understood exactly how to monetize mortality. This transformation of death into entertainment, of human suffering into profit, represents one of the most chilling aspects of gladiatorial combat. It reveals how easily civilized societies can develop institutions that dehumanize and exploit the vulnerable, wrapping brutality in spectacle and tradition until it becomes not only acceptable, but celebrated. The gladiators who entered the arena each day carried with them not only the weight of their weapons and armor, but the crushing burden of knowing that their lives had been reduced to a transaction in someone else's ledger. They faced death daily not just because of the physical dangers of combat, but because the entire economic system that surrounded them depended on their willingness to risk everything for the entertainment of others. And yet, even within this dehumanizing framework, the gladiators found ways to assert their humanity and dignity. But that resilience came at a cost. The spectacle of death had become so normalized, so commodified, that it dulled the very humanity the gladiators fought to preserve. The crowds that roared for blood today would forget the names of the fallen tomorrow. The lanistas who calculated profit margins rarely paused to consider the dreams that died with their investments. And the gladiators themselves, even as they formed bonds and found meaning, knew that their brotherhood was built on the foundation of their mutual destruction. This was perhaps the cruelest irony of the gladiatorial system. In their desperate attempts to hold on to their humanity, the gladiators inadvertently perpetuated the very machine that dehumanized them. Their courage made the games more thrilling. Their skill made the contests more valuable. Their resilience made the system more sustainable. They were trapped in a paradox where their greatest virtues became the instruments of their own oppression. The psychology of survival in the arena created its own twisted logic. New gladiators learned quickly that hope could be as dangerous as despair. Too much hope led to reckless dreams of freedom that would never come. Too little hope led to the kind of resignation that made death a certainty rather than a possibility. The successful gladiator learned to walk the razor's edge between these extremes, maintaining just enough hope to fight effectively, while accepting the reality that death was always one mistake away. This psychological balance manifested in the rituals and superstitions that flourished in the gladiatorial schools. Some fighters would never enter the arena without a specific charm or weapon. Others developed elaborate pre-fight routines that they believed would ensure their survival. These behaviors weren't merely superstitious quirks. They were psychological armor, ways of creating the illusion of control in a situation where control was largely an illusion. The gladiators also developed their own internal hierarchies and codes of honor that existed parallel to the official rankings imposed by their masters. Veterans earned respect not just for their skill, but for their wisdom in navigating the complex social dynamics of the school. They became mentors and protectors, passing down not just fighting techniques, but survival strategies that went far beyond combat. They taught newcomers how to read the crowd, how to gauge a promoter's intentions, how to survive when mercy was scarce. Yet even these bonds of mentorship carried their own burden. Veterans knew that every student they trained might one day face them in the arena. Every technique they taught might be turned against them. Every friendship they formed might end with one friend's sword finding the other's heart. This knowledge created a perpetual tension between the human need for connection and the brutal reality of their circumstances. The impact on families and loved ones outside the arena walls added another layer of psychological torment. Many gladiators had been torn from their families when enslaved, carrying the pain of separation into every fight. Others formed new relationships within the schools or with supporters in the city, creating fresh vulnerabilities. The knowledge that their death would devastate people they cared about could either motivate them to fight harder or paralyze them with the weight of responsibility. Some gladiators found solace in philosophy, particularly the Stoic teachings that emphasized acceptance of fate and the pursuit of virtue regardless of circumstances. Marcus Aurelius himself had written about the gladiators, noting how they faced death with dignity, while lesser men cowered from minor inconveniences. This philosophical framework provided a way to transform their suffering into something meaningful, to see their struggles as a form of spiritual discipline rather than mere brutality. The religious dimension of gladiatorial combat also offered psychological refuge for many fighters. They could frame their battles as sacrifices to the gods, their deaths as offerings that maintained the cosmic order. This spiritual interpretation transformed them from mere entertainers into participants in sacred ritual, elevating their suffering to a higher plane of meaning. The munera, after all, had originated as funeral rites, and many gladiators drew comfort from this connection to the divine. But perhaps the most profound psychological adaptation was the development of what we might call arena consciousness, a mental state that existed only within the confines of combat. In this state, gladiators reported a heightened awareness where time seemed to slow, where they could read their opponent's intentions with supernatural clarity, where fear transformed into a kind of transcendent focus. This state was both their salvation and their curse, for while it enabled them to survive, it also separated them further from ordinary human experience. The transition back to normal consciousness after each fight was jarring and often traumatic. Gladiators described feeling like strangers in their own bodies, struggling to reconcile the person who had just fought for their life with the person who now sat in their cell, contemplating what they had done. Some never fully made this transition, remaining perpetually suspended between their arena selves and their human selves, neither fully alive nor truly dead. This psychological fragmentation was compounded by the way society viewed them. They were simultaneously celebrated and reviled, desired and feared, admired and pitied. Women of high society might lavish attention on successful gladiators, while their husbands condemned the same men as worthless slaves. Children might idolize their fighting prowess, while their parents warned against following such a path. This contradictory social position left many gladiators feeling like they existed in a liminal space, belonging fully to neither the world of the free nor the world of the enslaved. The few gladiators who did achieve freedom often struggled to adapt to life outside the arena. The skills that had kept them alive in combat had little application in civilian life. The hypervigilance that had been essential for survival became a burden in peaceful settings. The brotherhood they had known in the schools was replaced by the isolation of trying to integrate into a society that viewed them with a mixture of awe and suspicion. Many freedmen found themselves drawn back to the gladiatorial world, working as trainers or guards, unable to fully escape the only life they had known. The economic reality also shaped the psychological landscape of the gladiators. They understood that their value was entirely dependent on their ability to provide entertainment. A gladiator who fought too defensively might survive longer, but would lose the crowd's favor, leading to reduced rations, poorer equipment, and eventually more dangerous opponents. Conversely, a gladiator who fought with spectacular aggression might win the crowd's adoration, but also attract more skilled opponents, eager to prove themselves against a popular fighter. Every choice carried risks that extended far beyond the immediate fight. This commodification of courage created its own form of psychological warfare. Gladiators had to constantly balance authenticity with performance, genuine emotion with calculated showmanship. They learned to manufacture rage when they felt fear, to project confidence when they were terrified, to turn their very suffering into entertainment. This performative aspect of their existence added yet another layer of alienation from their true selves. The gladiatorial system also exploited the human capacity for adaptation in ways that were both remarkable and tragic. Fighters developed an almost supernatural ability to compartmentalize trauma, to function effectively despite having witnessed and participated in horrific violence. This adaptation was necessary for survival, but it came at the cost of emotional numbness that could never be fully reversed. They became experts at living with contradiction, at finding meaning in meaninglessness, at maintaining hope in hopeless circumstances. The stories that emerge from the gladiatorial schools speak to this complex psychology. Tales of fighters who wept for their fallen opponents even as they struck the killing blow. Accounts of veterans who trained newcomers with paternal care while knowing they might be forced to kill them. descriptions of men who fought with savage intensity in the arena, but showed tender compassion in their daily interactions. These contradictions weren't signs of hypocrisy, but evidence of the extraordinary psychological flexibility required to survive in such an environment. Human resilience. The gladiator stepped into the arena, but his survival depended on more than just his skill with a blade. Every dawn brought a fresh reminder that death was not merely possible, it was probable, engineered, and profitable. While spectators cheered for blood, the fighters themselves navigated a labyrinth of calculated brutality where their lives hung in the balance not just during combat, but in every waking moment of their existence. The economic machinery surrounding gladiatorial combat transformed human lives into commodities with precise market values. Trainers invested heavily in their fighters, calculating the delicate balance between a gladiator's fighting potential and their expendability. A promising novice might receive better food and medical attention than a veteran whose reflexes had begun to slow. But this care was never about compassion. It was about return on investment. The more skilled a gladiator became, the more valuable they grew. Yet paradoxically, the more dangerous their matches became, as promoters sought to maximize the spectacle and profit from their abilities. This commodification created a perverse incentive structure where death was not just an occupational hazard, but a selling point. Promoters understood that audiences craved authentic mortal danger, not theatrical pretense. They carefully orchestrated matchups to ensure genuine life or death stakes, pairing fighters in ways that virtually guaranteed casualties. A gladiator might face an opponent specifically chosen to exploit their weaknesses, or find themselves thrust into scenarios where survival required not just defeating one enemy, but multiple adversaries in succession. The economics were ruthless. A spectacular death could generate more revenue than a routine victory. The gladiators themselves developed sophisticated coping mechanisms to function within this system of institutionalized mortality. Many adopted fatalistic philosophies, viewing each day as borrowed time and each sunrise as an unexpected gift. They created elaborate rituals before combat, not just for luck, but to achieve a mental state where death became acceptable, even welcome. Some fighters spoke of entering an almost meditative trance during battle, where the fear of dying dissolved into a strange peace with whatever outcome awaited them. These psychological adaptations extended beyond individual fighters to create a unique subculture within the gladiatorial schools. Veterans mentored newcomers, not just in combat techniques, but in the mental preparation for mortality. They shared stories of fallen comrades, not to frighten, but to normalize the reality that few gladiators died peacefully in their beds. This culture of acceptance was both tragic and remarkable. Human beings learning to function at peak performance while constantly aware that each performance might be their final one. The training regimens themselves reflected this daily dance with death. Gladiators practiced not just how to kill efficiently, but how to die with dignity. They learned to fall gracefully when mortally wounded, to acknowledge the crowd's verdict with composure, and to face the final thrust with courage. The schools taught them that a good death could earn posthumous respect and ensure their memory lived on, while a cowardly end would be quickly forgotten. This education in dying was as rigorous as their education in killing. Medical attention in the gladiatorial schools operated under the constant shadow of expendability. Physicians treated injuries with the understanding that they were prolonging lives temporarily, not preserving them indefinitely. A gladiator with a career-ending injury might receive minimal care, deemed no longer worth the investment. Those who showed promise received the best available treatment, but always with the knowledge that they were being healed only to face mortal danger again. The medical staff became complicit in this cycle, skilled at patching up human beings to be fed back into the machinery of death. The social dynamics among gladiators were profoundly shaped by the omnipresence of mortality. Friendships formed quickly and intensely, as men facing death together developed bonds that transcended normal social barriers. Yet these same friendships were constantly tested by the possibility that today's training partner might become tomorrow's mortal enemy in the arena. Some gladiators chose emotional isolation, refusing to form attachments that would make killing or dying more painful. Others embraced connection despite the risk, finding that human bonds made their precarious existence more meaningful. The influence of the crowd added another layer to this daily confrontation with death. Gladiators understood that their survival often depended not just on their fighting skills, but on their ability to entertain. A crowd that found a fighter boring or unsympathetic would readily call for their death, while one that was properly entertained might show mercy. This meant that gladiators had to be performers as well as warriors, constantly aware of their audience and skilled at manipulating crowd emotions, even while engaged in mortal combat. Religious and superstitious practices proliferated among gladiators as they sought any possible advantage against death. Many carried amulets, performed elaborate pre-fight rituals, or made offerings to various gods. These practices served both practical and psychological functions. While the gods might or might not intervene, the rituals provided structure and a sense of control in situations where control was largely illusory. The gladiators created their own mythology around death, developing beliefs about honorable versus dishonorable endings, the fate of warriors' souls, and the proper way to approach one's final moments. The administrators of gladiatorial games became experts in calibrating mortality rates to maximize both spectacle and economic sustainability. Too few deaths would disappoint audiences and reduce attendance, while too many would deplete the expensive trained fighter pool too quickly. They developed sophisticated systems for managing this balance, using preliminary matches with less valuable fighters to satisfy bloodlust, while preserving star gladiators for longer careers. Even mercy became a calculated decision, designed to create dramatic moments that would enhance the overall entertainment value. Female gladiators, though less common, faced additional layers of complexity in their relationship with death. Society's expectations about feminine behavior clashed with the brutal realities of the arena, creating unique psychological pressures. Some female fighters embraced a warrior identity that transcended traditional gender roles, while others struggled with the contradiction between their training as women and their profession as killers. Their deaths were often seen as particularly exotic entertainment, adding another dimension to their daily confrontation with mortality. The veterans who survived multiple years in the arena developed a particular wisdom about death that set them apart from both newcomers and the general population. They had seen so many companions die that death lost some of its terror while simultaneously becoming more real and immediate. These survivors often became philosophers of mortality, understanding life's fragility in ways that those who lived safer existences could never comprehend. Their hard-won insights about facing death shaped the culture of entire gladiatorial schools. The moment-to-moment experience of living under constant death threat created a heightened awareness that transformed how gladiators experienced existence itself. Colors seemed more vivid, food tasted more intense, and simple pleasures like warmth or rest became profound experiences. This intensification of sensation was both a gift and a burden. While it made their limited time more meaningful, it also made the prospect of losing these heightened experiences more painful. The gladiatorial system's relationship with death was ultimately a reflection of broader societal attitudes about human value, entertainment, and mortality. It revealed how easily civilized people could become complicit in systematic killing when it was properly packaged and presented. The gladiators themselves became unwilling philosophers, forced to confront questions about courage, meaning, and dignity that most people could avoid. Their daily dance with death illuminated both the worst and best aspects of human nature: the capacity for cruelty and the remarkable ability to find meaning and maintain dignity even in the most dehumanizing circumstances. In this arena of calculated mortality, every sunrise represented not just another day of life, but another step closer to an almost inevitable violent end. The arena erupted with a bone-chilling roar as Marcus adjusted his grip on the gladius, sweat mixing with sand beneath his calloused feet. 20,000 spectators screamed for blood while he stared across the dusty floor at his opponent, knowing that in mere moments, one of them would be dead. This was not mere entertainment. This was the calculated machinery of death that kept the Roman Empire's bloodlust satisfied, and Marcus was just another cog in that merciless wheel. The gladiatorial system wasn't born from Roman sadism alone. It evolved from ancient funeral rites where prisoners of war were sacrificed to honor the dead. But by the height of the empire, it had transformed into something far more sinister: a massive economic engine that turned human suffering into profit. The Romans didn't just want to watch men die, they wanted to watch them die beautifully, skillfully, with the kind of choreographed violence that would make the gods themselves applaud. Every gladiator who stepped into that arena carried with him the weight of a system designed to extract maximum drama from human mortality. The lanista, or gladiator trainer, wasn't interested in keeping his fighters alive out of compassion. He was protecting an investment. A skilled gladiator represented years of training, thousands of denarii in equipment, and the potential for enormous gate receipts. Yet paradoxically, the crowd demanded real death, authentic terror, genuine blood, soaking into the sand. This created a fascinating economic tension. Dead gladiators generated no future revenue, but fights without mortal stakes bored the audience. The solution was elegantly brutal: create a system where death was probable enough to thrill the masses, but not so certain that it destroyed the business model entirely. The result was a carefully calibrated dance of mortality that kept both the crowds and the accountants satisfied. The life of a gladiator began long before he ever saw the arena. Most were slaves, captured in Rome's endless wars of expansion, though some were condemned criminals, and a surprising number were volunteers, free men who sold themselves into this lethal profession for the promise of glory and gold. Regardless of how they arrived, their transformation from human being to fighting machine was methodical and brutal. The gladiator schools, or ludi, were part military barracks, part prison, part medical facility. Here, men learned not just how to fight, but how to die with dignity. They were fed better than most Roman citizens. A gladiator needed muscle and strength to put on a good show. But this physical conditioning came at a psychological cost that modern minds can barely fathom. Imagine waking every morning knowing that your purpose in life was to provide entertainment through your potential death. Every friendship you formed was with someone who might be ordered to kill you next week. Every skill you developed was ultimately in service of a more spectacular demise. The gladiators developed their own culture, their own codes of honor, their own ways of finding meaning in an existence that treated them as expensive livestock. The training was relentless and scientific. Different types of gladiators specialized in different fighting styles. The heavily armored Mumio with his fish-crested helmet, the net-wielding Retiarius who fought nearly naked, the mounted Equites who battled on horseback. Each style had specific techniques, specific weaknesses, specific ways of dying that the crowd found most entertaining. But the training wasn't just about swordplay. Gladiators learned to read the crowd, to understand the subtle politics of the arena. A skilled fighter could sometimes talk his way out of death by giving the audience what they wanted: a good show, a dramatic gesture, a moment of unexpected mercy or surprising brutality. The thumbs up or thumbs down of the crowd was never guaranteed, and a gladiator's survival often depended as much on his theatrical instincts as his martial prowess. The medical care provided to gladiators was remarkably advanced for its time, but it served the economic interests of the games rather than humanitarian concerns. Skilled physicians studied gladiatorial wounds with scientific precision, developing new techniques for treating trauma that would later benefit Roman legions. But this medical attention was always calculated: patch them up quickly so they could fight again, or let them die if the cost of treatment exceeded their value as entertainment. Between the fights, gladiators lived in a strange liminal space between slavery and celebrity. Successful fighters became household names, their images sold on oil lamps and decorative pottery. Women of all social classes threw themselves at gladiators, fascinated by men who lived so close to death. Yet these same heroes could be executed on a whim. Their lives forfeit the moment they cease to be profitable or entertaining. The psychological coping mechanisms that gladiators developed were as varied as the men themselves. Some embraced a fatalistic philosophy, accepting death as inevitable and finding peace in that acceptance. Others cultivated rage, using anger as fuel for survival. Many turned to religion. The mystery cults were popular among gladiators, offering promises of meaning and redemption that the Roman state religion couldn't provide. Perhaps most remarkably, they formed genuine bonds of brotherhood within a system designed to pit them against each other. Gladiators would share techniques, nurse each other's wounds, and sometimes even refuse to fight friends in the arena. These acts of defiance were rare and dangerous, but they represented a stubborn insistence on human connection in the face of systematic dehumanization. The day of the games brought its own rituals and terrors. Gladiators would eat their final meal together, knowing that some of them would not see another sunrise. They underwent religious purification, made offerings to their gods, and said what might be their final goodbyes. But even in that moment of supreme vulnerability, the gladiators maintained their dignity and their humanity. They had learned to transform their fear into performance, their desperation into art. The arena was their stage, and they were determined to exit it with honor, whether through victory or a death so brave and beautiful that it would be remembered long after the last spectator had gone home. This was the daily reality for thousands of men throughout the Roman Empire, an existence where death was not just possible, but probable, where survival depended on the whims of a crowd that saw them as entertainment rather than human beings. But this calculated dance between death and profit was only one layer of the brutal machine that consumed gladiators daily. Because beyond the economic calculations, beyond the careful choreography of violence for entertainment, lay something far more insidious: the psychological warfare that these fighters endured every single day of their lives. Picture this: you wake up in a cramped cell, your body already aching from yesterday's training wounds. The first sound you hear isn't birdsong or the gentle murmur of a peaceful morning. It's the screaming. Always the screaming. Sometimes it's the raw agony of a gladiator having his wounds cauterized with red-hot iron. Other times it's the primal roar of a man losing his mind, finally snapping under the relentless pressure of knowing that today might be the day he dies for someone else's amusement. This wasn't just physical brutality. This was a systematic destruction of the human psyche, engineered with surgical precision by a society that had turned human suffering into the highest form of entertainment. Every aspect of a gladiator's existence was designed to break them down mentally before they ever stepped foot in the arena. The Romans understood something that modern psychologists are only now beginning to grasp. The anticipation of death is often more torturous than death itself, and they weaponize this knowledge with ruthless efficiency. Gladiators weren't just told they might die. They were forced to live in a constant state of suspended execution, never knowing if the next sunrise would be their last. Think about the mind games involved here. These men would spend months, sometimes years, training alongside fellow gladiators. They'd eat together, sleep in adjacent cells, share stories of their former lives. They'd form bonds that in any other context would be called friendship, even brotherhood. And then, without warning, they'd be told that tomorrow they would try to kill each other while thousands of spectators cheered for blood. The lanista, the gladiator trainer, was a master of psychological manipulation. He knew exactly how to push each fighter to their breaking point without completely destroying their will to fight. Too much pressure, and the gladiator would become suicidal, useless in the arena. Too little, and they might retain enough hope to attempt escape or rebellion. It was a delicate balance, and these trainers had perfected it over generations. They would use isolation as a weapon. A gladiator who showed signs of forming too strong a bond with his fellow fighters might suddenly find himself moved to solitary confinement for weeks. The message was clear: trust no one, rely on no one, because everyone around you is either trying to kill you or profit from your death. But perhaps the most diabolical aspect of this psychological torture was how the Romans convinced many gladiators that their suffering had meaning. They created elaborate mythologies around gladiatorial combat, painting these death matches as sacred rituals that honored the gods and demonstrated Roman virtue. They told the gladiators that their deaths would be glorious, that they would achieve a form of immortality through their courage in the arena. Some gladiators, broken by years of this indoctrination, actually began to believe it. They would volunteer for the most dangerous fights, convinced that dying spectacularly in the arena was preferable to the slow, psychological death of continued captivity. The Romans had achieved the ultimate victory. They had convinced their victims to participate willingly in their own destruction, and the crowd played their part in this psychological warfare too. The spectators weren't just passive observers, they were active participants in the mental torture of the gladiators. Their cheers and jeers could determine whether a fallen fighter lived or died. They held the power of life and death in their collective voice, and they wielded it with the casual cruelty of children pulling wings off flies. Imagine being a gladiator, wounded and defeated, lying in the sand while your life hung in the balance based on whether the crowd thought you had entertained them sufficiently. The humiliation was almost unbearable. These were men who had once been warriors, farmers, free citizens. Now they were reduced to begging for their lives from people who saw them as nothing more than exotic animals performing tricks. The gladiators developed coping mechanisms, of course. They had to, or they would have gone completely insane. Some turned to religion, desperately clinging to beliefs that promised them something better in the afterlife. Others embraced a kind of fatalistic philosophy, accepting their fate with stoic resignation. A few even found twisted pride in their skills as killers, convincing themselves that they were artists of death, craftsmen of violence. But the most common coping mechanism was perhaps the most tragic. They learned to disconnect emotionally from their own lives. They would speak of themselves in the third person, as if their bodies belonged to someone else. They would plan for futures they knew they would never see, discussing what they would do when they earned their freedom, even though they knew the chances of survival were infinitesimally small. This emotional detachment became so complete that many gladiators seemed almost zombie-like outside the arena. Visitors to gladiator schools often commented on how eerily calm and quiet these men were, how they moved through their daily routines with mechanical precision, showing no emotion, no spark of the humanity that should have been their birthright. The women who became gladiators faced an additional layer of psychological torture. They were not only fighting for their lives, but also battling against the deeply ingrained Roman belief that women were inherently weak and unsuited for combat. Every victory was dismissed as a fluke. Every defeat was seen as proof of feminine inferiority. They had to prove themselves worthy of respect over and over again, knowing that no amount of skill or courage would ever truly change how society viewed them. And then there were the gladiators, who were forced to fight in elaborate historical reenactments, dressed as famous warriors from Rome's past or mythological figures. They were required to die in specific ways, following predetermined scripts that turned their real deaths into theatrical performances. Imagine the psychological impact of being told not just that you must die, but exactly how you must die, all for the entertainment of people who would forget your name before they finished their wine. The most insidious part of this entire system was how it was presented to the Roman public as normal, even virtuous. Children grew up attending gladiatorial games as casually as modern children go to baseball games. They learned to associate human suffering with entertainment, violence with virtue, death with glory. The psychological damage wasn't limited to the gladiators themselves. It infected entire generations of Romans who became increasingly desensitized to brutality. Some gladiators tried to maintain their sanity by holding on to memories of their former lives. They would whisper stories of their families, their homes, their dreams to anyone who would listen. But even these memories became weapons against them. The trainers would learn about their loved ones and use that knowledge to manipulate them. A gladiator might be told that his wife had remarried, that his children had forgotten him, that he was already dead to everyone who had ever mattered to him. The suicide rate among gladiators was astronomical, though the Romans rarely recorded these deaths accurately. They preferred to maintain the fiction that gladiators died only in glorious combat, not in the dark corners of their cells, overwhelmed by despair. But the evidence was there for anyone willing to look. The constant need for new recruits, the elaborate security measures designed to prevent self-harm, the way certain gladiators would simply stop fighting effectively, choosing death over continued suffering. And yet, incredibly, some gladiators not only survived this psychological onslaught, but found ways to thrive within it. They developed their own codes of honor, their own support networks, their own meaning in the face of meaninglessness. They proved that the human spirit, while it can be bent and broken, sometimes refuses to be completely destroyed. These survivors often became the most dangerous gladiators of all, not because they were the most skilled fighters, but because they had learned to weaponize their own trauma. They fought with the fury of men who had nothing left to lose, the precision of those who had accepted death as a constant companion, and the wisdom of those who had seen through the lies that society used to justify their suffering. But for every gladiator who found a way to maintain their humanity in the face of systematic dehumanization, dozens more were lost to madness, despair, or the simple grinding brutality of a system designed to consume human lives for profit and entertainment. The psychological toll of gladiatorial combat wasn't just an unfortunate side effect of the system. It was the system working exactly as intended, breaking down human beings until they became nothing more than instruments of violence, products to be bought and sold and ultimately discarded. This is what it really meant to face death daily as a gladiator. It wasn't just about the physical danger of combat. It was about having your very identity, your sense of self, your connection to your own humanity, systematically stripped away until death in the arena seemed not like a tragedy, but like a mercy. The Romans had created a machine that didn't just kill bodies. Based on the systematic dehumanization and constant death threats faced by gladiators in ancient Rome, where their lives were reduced to mere commodities for entertainment, we can now examine how these fighters developed psychological mechanisms to cope with their horrific circumstances while still being trapped within a machine designed to exploit and ultimately consume them. The gladiatorial system created what we might call a psychological prison within the physical prison. Every aspect of a gladiator's existence was carefully orchestrated to break down their individual identity and rebuild them as fighting machines. They were given stage names that often reflected their fighting style or origin, stripping away their birth names and personal histories. This renaming process was the first step in a comprehensive program of psychological reconditioning that would define the rest of their shortened lives. Within the ludus, gladiators formed complex social hierarchies that mirrored the very system oppressing them. Veterans who had survived multiple fights gained status and respect, becoming mentors to newer fighters. These relationships provided crucial emotional support, but they also served the system's purposes by creating internal structures that maintained order without requiring constant external oversight. The gladiators essentially became complicit in their own oppression, policing themselves and training each other to be more effective killers. The psychological impact of constant proximity to death cannot be overstated. Gladiators lived in a state of perpetual anticipation, knowing that each training session might be their last, that each meal could be their final one. This created a unique form of trauma that modern psychology might recognize as a combination of anticipatory grief and survivor's guilt. Those who lived through multiple contests often developed what we might now call post-traumatic stress disorder, though such concepts were unknown to ancient physicians. Religious practices became a crucial coping mechanism for many gladiators. They developed elaborate rituals around combat, invoking various gods for protection and strength. Some adopted mystery religions that promised salvation in the afterlife, finding comfort in beliefs that transcended their immediate circumstances. Others turned to more practical superstitions, carrying lucky charms or following specific pre-fight routines that gave them a sense of control in an otherwise powerless situation. The gladiators also developed their own cultural codes and forms of honor that existed parallel to Roman values. While Romans viewed them as subhuman entertainment, gladiators created internal systems of respect based on skill, courage, and loyalty to fellow fighters. A gladiator who fought bravely, even in defeat, could earn the admiration of his peers. These alternative value systems provided a form of psychological resistance against the dehumanization imposed by their captors. Perhaps most tragically, many gladiators internalized aspects of the system that oppressed them. Some began to take pride in their fighting prowess, finding identity and self-worth in their ability to kill effectively. This psychological adaptation allowed them to function within the system, but also made them more effective tools of the very apparatus that sought to destroy them. They became living embodiments of Stockholm Syndrome, identifying with their captors' values while simultaneously being victimized by them. The few gladiators who achieved fame and crowd favor faced their own unique psychological burdens. While their popularity might extend their lives temporarily, it also intensified the pressure to perform. They became brands, their personalities and fighting styles commodified for public consumption. The cheering crowds that celebrated their victories were the same people who would demand their deaths if they failed to entertain adequately. For gladiators with families, the psychological toll was compounded by helplessness regarding their loved ones' welfare. Many had been separated from wives and children when enslaved, and the uncertainty about their families' fates added another layer of torment to their daily existence. Some gladiators never learned whether their families had survived the conflicts or raids that led to their own enslavement. The system also employed psychological manipulation through the promise of eventual freedom. The concept of the wooden sword granted to gladiators who had served with distinction, dangled hope before fighters while ensuring their continued compliance. However, the reality was that very few gladiators lived long enough to earn their freedom, and those who did often found themselves with nowhere to go and no skills applicable to civilian life. Training itself became a form of psychological conditioning. The repetitive drilling of combat techniques, the constant focus on violence and survival, gradually reshaped the gladiators' mental processes. They learned to compartmentalize emotions, to view other human beings as obstacles to overcome rather than fellow sufferers. This mental conditioning was necessary for survival, but came at the cost of their fundamental humanity. The gladiatorial schools also fostered a culture of fatalism that served the system's needs while providing psychological comfort to the fighters. The belief that fate controlled their destinies allowed gladiators to face combat with a form of resignation that made them more effective fighters while simultaneously robbing them of agency over their own lives. This fatalistic worldview became both a coping mechanism and a form of mental imprisonment. Some gladiators found solace in forming romantic relationships within the confines of their circumstances, though these connections were always shadowed by the knowledge that death could separate them at any moment. These relationships provided emotional sustenance, but also created additional vulnerabilities that the system could exploit. A gladiator fighting to protect or provide for a loved one might fight more desperately, but also more recklessly. The constant exposure to violence and death also desensitized many gladiators to suffering, both their own and others. This psychological numbing was a protective mechanism that allowed them to function in their horrific environment, but it also represented a profound loss of human empathy and connection. They became efficient killers, partly because they had learned to suppress the natural human responses that would make killing difficult. Even in their final moments, gladiators faced psychological manipulation. The elaborate rituals surrounding death in the arena, the crowd's judgment on whether they had fought worthily, and the theatrical elements of their demise all served to transform their deaths into entertainment while denying them dignity in their final moments. The system managed to exploit them even as they died, turning their last breaths into spectacle for others' amusement. The psychological legacy of the gladiatorial system extended beyond individual fighters to shape Roman society's relationship with violence and human worth. The normalization of treating human life as disposable entertainment created psychological patterns that influenced how Romans viewed slavery, warfare, and social hierarchy. The arena became a laboratory for studying how systematic dehumanization could be implemented and sustained on a massive scale. The coping mechanisms developed by gladiators, the formation of alternative communities, the creation of parallel value systems, the adoption of fatalistic worldviews, would be echoed throughout history by other oppressed groups facing systematic dehumanization. Their psychological adaptations represent both human resilience and the tragic capacity of people to adjust to even the most horrific circumstances when survival depends on it. Understanding the psychological dimension of gladiatorial combat reveals the true sophistication of Roman oppression. The system didn't merely kill bodies, it systematically destroyed minds, spirits, and identities while extracting maximum entertainment value from the process. Now, imagine the amphitheater packed to the brim, 30,000 spectators screaming for blood as the gladiators march into the arena. Their polished armor glints under the scorching Roman sun. But beneath those bronze breastplates and leather guards, their hearts pound with the terrible knowledge that today might be their last. You see, what most people don't realize about gladiatorial combat is that it wasn't just entertainment. It was a carefully orchestrated psychological experiment in human endurance, designed to push men beyond their breaking point while extracting maximum profit from their suffering. The gladiators, who survived long enough to become veterans, had developed something that modern psychologists would recognize as a form of institutionalized trauma bonding. They created intricate mental frameworks to cope with the daily reality that their lives hung by the thinnest of threads. Some turned to the mystery religions that flourished in Rome's underground, finding solace in cults of Mithras or the Egyptian goddess Isis. These secret brotherhoods offered what the official state religion could not, a sense of purpose that transcended the brutal mathematics of kill or be killed. Veterans would divide their existence into 3 categories: days already survived, days likely remaining, and days that belonged entirely to the gods. This wasn't mere superstition. It was a sophisticated psychological strategy that allowed them to compartmentalize their fear and function, despite the overwhelming odds against their survival. They would wake each morning and mentally place that day into one of these 3 categories, creating a sense of control in a world designed to strip them of all agency. The gladiator schools themselves were masterpieces of psychological manipulation, designed not just to train fighters, but to break down their individual identities and rebuild them as profit-generating killing machines. New recruits underwent what we would now recognize as a systematic program of dehumanization. This wasn't just legal formality. It was a ritual designed to sever their connection to their former lives and remake them as instruments of violence. The trainers, many of whom were former gladiators themselves, understood exactly how to push the human psyche to its limits without causing complete psychological collapse. They would alternate between brutal punishment and unexpected kindness, creating a dependency relationship that kept the gladiators emotionally off balance and easier to control. One day a gladiator might be beaten unconscious for a minor infraction. The next he might receive extra rations or a brief visit from a prostitute. This unpredictable pattern of reward and punishment created what psychologists now call learned helplessness, a state where victims become so conditioned to their captivity that they stop trying to escape even when opportunities present themselves. The arena itself was designed as a theatre of controlled chaos, where every element was calculated to maximize both spectator excitement and gladiator desperation. The sand that covered the floor wasn't just there to absorb blood. It was specially treated with chemicals that would make wounds more visible to the crowd, turning each cut and gash into a crimson spectacle. The underground chambers beneath the arena floor housed not just wild animals, but elaborate mechanical devices that could flood sections with water, raise platforms, or create artificial earthquakes. Gladiators never knew what surprises awaited them, adding an element of psychological terror that went far beyond simple combat. But here's where the system revealed its true cruelty. The gladiators weren't just fighting for their lives, they were fighting for an audience that viewed their suffering as entertainment. The crowd's bloodlust became another weapon in the arena, as gladiators learned to read the mood of the spectators and adjust their fighting style accordingly. A boring fight might result in both combatants being executed, while a spectacular display of violence could earn freedom or at least another day of life. This forced the gladiators to become performers as well as warriors, adding yet another layer of psychological pressure to an already impossible situation. The most successful gladiators developed what we might call arena personas, carefully crafted identities that appealed to different segments of the crowd. Some became the noble hero, fighting with honor and dignity even in defeat. Others embraced the role of the savage barbarian, terrifying spectators with displays of seemingly inhuman brutality. These personas weren't just performance art, they were survival strategies that allowed gladiators to maintain some sense of self while giving the crowd what it demanded. And through all of this systematic brutalization, the gladiatorial system continued to function because it had successfully convinced both participants and spectators that this was the natural order of things. Slaves and criminals deserved their fate, the crowd deserved their entertainment, and the empire deserved the revenue that flowed from this carefully orchestrated machinery of death. The gladiators themselves became complicit in their own exploitation, competing not just for survival, but for the fleeting glory that came with crowd approval and the slim possibility of eventual freedom. The daily routine of a gladiator was designed to maintain this delicate balance between hope and despair. They would wake before dawn for training sessions that combined physical conditioning with psychological conditioning. They practiced not just sword work and tactics, but also the dramatic gestures and crowd-pleasing moves that could mean the difference between life and death in the arena. They learned to fall gracefully when wounded, to make their pain visible to the crowd, and to die with enough spectacle to satisfy the bloodthirsty masses. Even their meals were part of the psychological control system. Gladiators were fed well, better than most slaves or even free citizens. But this generosity came with strings attached. The rich food and wine created a dependency, making the gladiators physically stronger while psychologically binding them to their captors. They knew that rebellion meant not just death, but a return to starvation and deprivation that many found worse than the prospect of dying in combat. The veterans who had survived multiple encounters in the arena often spoke of a strange transformation that occurred after their first few victories. The initial terror gave way to a kind of numbness, and then, for some, to something even more disturbing, a genuine enjoyment of the violence. These gladiators had been so thoroughly conditioned by the system that they had internalized its values, finding meaning and identity in their ability to kill efficiently and entertainingly. The gladiatorial arena wasn't just a place of death, it was a carefully orchestrated theatre of trauma, where the very architecture of psychological destruction was built into every stone and every ritual. By the time a gladiator stepped onto the blood-soaked sand, his mind had already been systematically dismantled and rebuilt to serve the empire's appetite for spectacle. You see, the real genius of the Roman system wasn't in training men to fight, it was in training them to accept their own expendability. Every morning ritual, every meal, every prayer was designed to reinforce one simple truth. Your life belongs to the crowd, and death is not just possible, but inevitable. The ludus operated like a psychological laboratory where human beings were transformed into willing participants in their own potential execution. New arrivals weren't just taught sword techniques, they were subjected to elaborate conditioning that would make modern psychologists shudder. Sleep deprivation, unpredictable feeding schedules, and constant exposure to the sounds of combat created a state of perpetual anxiety that made gladiators hyper-alert yet emotionally numb. But perhaps the most insidious element was the ritual of the morning sacrifice. Before any training session, gladiators were forced to witness the slaughter of animals, while priests chanted prayers to Mars and Nemesis. This wasn't religious ceremony, it was systematic desensitization. Day after day, they watched blood flow and life drain away until death became as mundane as breakfast. The trainers understood something that modern trauma specialists are only beginning to grasp. When you control someone's relationship with mortality, you control everything. Gladiators were taught to visualize their own deaths in graphic detail during meditation sessions. They practiced dying gracefully, falling with dignity, even smiling as the sword found its mark. This wasn't bravery, it was psychological programming. The social isolation was equally calculated. Gladiators were forbidden from forming deep friendships, knowing that tomorrow they might face their closest companion across the arena floor. This emotional detachment served a dual purpose. It prevented rebellion through unity, while ensuring that each man faced his fate alone, psychologically speaking. And then there were the drugs. Recent archaeological evidence suggests that gladiators were regularly given concoctions containing opium, cannabis, and other psychoactive substances, not for pain relief, but for mental conditioning. These compounds, mixed with wine and administered during group meals, created a hazy dissociation from reality that made the violence feel dreamlike and distant. The economics of this psychological manipulation were staggering. A well-conditioned gladiator who could die beautifully was worth more than one who simply fought well. Crowd reactions were carefully studied, and trainers adjusted their psychological techniques based on what produced the most satisfying deaths from the audience's perspective. The gladiators developed their own coping mechanisms, but even these were co-opted by the system. Their prayers became performances, their brotherhood became marketing, their courage became commodity. The very human responses that should have preserved their dignity instead became tools for their exploitation. What's perhaps most chilling is how willingly many gladiators embraced this psychological framework. They didn't just accept their fate. They began to crave the arena's twisted validation. The roar of the crowd became their only source of meaning, and death in combat became their only path to immortality. This wasn't simply about entertainment. It was about demonstrating Rome's power to transform human nature itself. Every gladiator who died with grace was proof that the empire could take a man's most fundamental instinct for survival and reshape it into a performance of submission. The gladiatorial system represents perhaps history's most sophisticated example of institutionalized psychological warfare waged against the human spirit. It shows us how quickly our most basic survival instincts can be reprogrammed when subjected to systematic trauma, social isolation, and the promise of fleeting glory. These men didn't just face death daily. They were psychologically engineered to embrace it, to find meaning in their own destruction, and to transform their suffering into spectacle. The gladiatorial arenas were more than mere entertainment venues. They were sophisticated engines of psychological manipulation that transformed death into a commodity. Every element, from the elaborate pre-fight rituals to the carefully choreographed moments of mercy or execution, was designed to extract maximum emotional impact from both participants and spectators. The gladiators themselves became unwilling actors in a macabre theatre where their genuine terror, pain, and fleeting moments of triumph were packaged and sold to a bloodthirsty audience. But perhaps the most insidious aspect of this system was how it weaponized hope itself. The possibility of freedom, of earning enough victories to purchase one's liberty, dangled before every gladiator like a mirage in the desert. This hope became both salvation and torment, driving men to fight with desperate ferocity while simultaneously ensuring their continued participation in their own exploitation. The arena masters understood that a gladiator who had given up was worthless as entertainment. Only those who still believed they might survive provided the authentic desperation that crowds craved. The crowd's relationship with the gladiators was equally complex and disturbing. These spectators weren't merely passive observers. They were active participants in a ritual of dehumanization. They learned to see the fighters not as fellow human beings, but as symbols, archetypes in an ongoing drama of power and submission. The Germanic barbarian, the exotic African, the disgraced Roman citizen. Each gladiator type carried specific cultural meanings that allowed the audience to project their fears, prejudices, and fantasies onto the arena floor. This commodification of human suffering created a feedback loop that corrupted everyone involved. The more spectacular the deaths, the larger the crowds. The larger the crowds, the greater the financial incentives to push gladiators beyond human limits. Trainers developed increasingly sophisticated methods of conditioning their fighters not just physically, but psychologically, breaking down their sense of self-worth until they internalized their status as expendable entertainment. The economic machinery behind the games was staggering in its scope and efficiency. Entire industries sprang up to support the gladiatorial system. Specialized breeders who raised and trained fighters like livestock, weapons manufacturers who crafted instruments of death designed for maximum visual impact, even entrepreneurs who collected and sold the blood-soaked sand from arena floors as supposed medicinal remedies. Every drop of gladiator blood generated profit for someone. Yet within this system of absolute exploitation, Some gladiators managed to forge bonds of genuine brotherhood. In the barracks, away from the roaring crowds and the calculating eyes of their masters, they created their own codes of honor and mutual support. They taught each other fighting techniques, shared meager rations with the wounded, and provided comfort to those facing almost certain death. These relationships became acts of resistance against a system designed to strip them of their humanity. The psychological toll extended far beyond the arena walls. Gladiators who survived multiple fights often developed what we might recognize today as severe post-traumatic stress. They experienced nightmares, flashbacks, and a numbing detachment from normal human emotions. Many turned to religious cults that promised meaning in their suffering or redemption in an afterlife. Others descended into alcoholism or self-destructive behavior, unable to process the constant cycle of violence and survival. The trainers and arena officials weren't immune to this psychological corruption either. Men who spent their days calculating how to maximize the entertainment value of human death gradually lost their capacity for normal empathy. They developed a cold, clinical approach to human suffering that allowed them to function within the system, but left them emotionally hollowed out. Many became addicted to the power they wielded over life and death, finding ordinary existence pale and meaningless by comparison. The gladiatorial system also created a perverse form of celebrity culture that prefigured many aspects of modern entertainment. Successful gladiators became household names, their fighting styles copied by aspiring warriors, their personal dramas followed with obsessive interest by fans. But this fame came at the ultimate price. The more famous a gladiator became, the greater the pressure to take increasingly dangerous risks to maintain audience interest. The women caught up in this system faced particular horrors. Female gladiators, though rare, were subjected to additional layers of humiliation and sexual exploitation. Even those who weren't fighters, the wives and daughters of gladiators, lived in constant fear of their loved ones' deaths, and often faced destitution when the primary breadwinner fell in the arena. The system created entire communities of widows and orphans whose grief became another form of entertainment for the crowds. The medical practitioners who worked in the gladiatorial schools occupied an especially dark corner of this world. These were skilled physicians who had perverted their healing arts to serve the machinery of death. They became experts at keeping severely wounded men alive just long enough to provide a few more moments of spectacle, at treating injuries in ways that would allow fighters to return to combat as quickly as possible, regardless of long-term consequences. The religious dimensions of gladiatorial combat added another layer of psychological complexity. Many gladiators adopted fatalistic philosophies that helped them cope with their circumstances, viewing each day as potentially their last and finding strange peace in the certainty of eventual death. Others embraced mystery religions that promised transformation through suffering, turning their ordeal into a form of spiritual trial. As we contemplate this systematic destruction of human dignity, we must remember that the gladiatorial games weren't an aberration or a relic of a more primitive time. They were the logical extension of a society that had normalized slavery, conquest, and the exploitation of the powerless. The arena simply concentrated and refined these existing brutalities into their most pure and profitable form. The gladiatorial arena was a theater of death. But by now, you understand that the true tragedy wasn't simply the violence itself. It was how an entire civilization became complicit in reducing human beings to commodities. The crowds, the trainers, the officials, even the gladiators themselves all became trapped within a system that demanded blood as the price of entertainment. Yet perhaps the most haunting aspect of this brutal institution was how it revealed the gladiators' capacity for humanity, even in the face of systematic dehumanization. In stolen moments between training sessions, they formed genuine friendships that transcended tribal boundaries. They shared meager rations with wounded comrades. They taught newcomers the subtle techniques that might keep them alive one more day. Some even found love within the ludus walls, creating fragile bonds of tenderness amid an ocean of cruelty. These acts of compassion weren't grand gestures recorded by historians. They were quiet rebellions against a system designed to strip away their humanity. When a veteran gladiator steadied a trembling novice before his first fight, when fighters shared intelligence about their opponent's weaknesses, when they honored fallen comrades with makeshift funeral rites, they were asserting their fundamental human dignity. The gladiators understood something their audiences often forgot, that courage isn't the absence of fear, but action taken despite overwhelming terror. Every morning, they faced the possibility of a painful, public death. Yet they continued to train, to fight, to hope. They developed their own codes of honor, their own rituals of remembrance, their own ways of finding meaning in what appeared to be meaningless suffering. Some gladiators even achieved a form of immortality that their owners never intended. Their names, Spartacus, Flamma, Carpophorus, echo through history not as mere entertainers, but as symbols of human resilience. They remind us that even in the darkest circumstances, people can choose how they face their fate. They can decide whether to surrender their humanity or to guard it fiercely, regardless of how others see them. The gladiatorial system eventually crumbled, as all systems built on human exploitation eventually do, but the lessons from the arena remain painfully relevant. In our own time, we still witness the commodification of human beings, the reduction of complex individuals to simple categories, the transformation of genuine human suffering into entertainment for distant audiences. The gladiators teach us that our humanity isn't determined by our circumstances, but by our choices within those circumstances. They show us that dignity can survive even when freedom cannot. And they remind us that sometimes the greatest victory isn't in the arena, but in refusing to let the arena define who you are. As we close this examination of their brutal world, we honor not just their courage in facing death, but their stubborn insistence on remaining human in a system designed to make them less than human. Their legacy isn't written in the sand of the Colosseum, but in every moment when someone chooses compassion over cruelty, connection over isolation, hope over despair. The gladiators faced death daily, not just because they were forced to fight, but because they dared to remain human in an inhuman world. As we reach the final chapter of our journey through the brutal world of ancient gladiators, we must confront the ultimate truth that shadows every aspect of their existence. The arena was not merely a place of entertainment or even systematic cruelty, but something far more profound and disturbing. It was a machine designed to extract the very essence of human dignity and transform it into spectacle, profit, and political power. The gladiators who survived long enough to understand this system found themselves trapped in a paradox that would define their remaining days. They had become masters of violence, yet slaves to the very crowds who cheered their prowess. They had achieved a form of celebrity that ancient Rome reserved for few, yet remained property to be bought, sold, and discarded at will. Most haunting of all, they had discovered that their greatest victories often felt like defeats, and their defeats sometimes carried more honor than triumph. Consider the veteran gladiator in his final years, scarred beyond recognition, joints stiffened by countless battles, reflexes dulled by age and accumulated trauma. He has survived what no human should survive, witnessed horrors that would break lesser minds, and yet he continues to wake each morning knowing that death awaits him in the sand. Not the clean death of a warrior fallen in battle, but the choreographed death of a performer whose usefulness has expired. These men and women developed coping mechanisms that bordered on the supernatural. They learned to compartmentalize their humanity so thoroughly that they could butcher a friend in the morning and mourn him in the evening. They created elaborate rituals around their weapons, their meals, their prayers, treating each small act as potentially their last. Some found solace in the gladiator cults that worshipped death itself, embracing the inevitability of their fate as a form of twisted liberation. The psychological toll of this existence cannot be overstated. Modern veterans of combat speak of post-traumatic stress, survivor's guilt, and the difficulty of returning to civilian life after experiencing the ultimate extremes of human behavior. Now imagine experiencing this not once, not in a single deployment, but every few weeks for years on end, with no hope of discharge, no return to normalcy, no end except death. Yet within this system of absolute dehumanization, sparks of genuine humanity somehow persevered. Gladiators formed bonds that transcended the artificial divisions their masters imposed. Veterans mentored newcomers not because they were ordered to, but because they recognized something of themselves in the terror of the untested fighter. They shared techniques not to create more efficient killers, but to give their brothers and sisters a chance to see another sunrise. The crowds who flocked to witness these spectacles were themselves victims of a different kind of brutalization. The Roman citizens who cheered for blood had been systematically conditioned to view human suffering as entertainment, to find pleasure in death, to mistake cruelty for strength. They were complicit not just in individual murders, but in the perpetuation of a system that degraded everyone it touched, spectator and participant alike. The economic machinery that supported the games reveals perhaps the most chilling aspect of this entire enterprise. The gladiator schools were businesses, pure and simple, designed to maximize profit from human misery. Every aspect of a gladiator's existence, from their diet to their training regimen to their medical care, was calculated to extract the maximum value from their bodies before discarding them. The trainers who shaped these fighters were not coaches or mentors, but livestock managers optimizing their investment. The medical knowledge developed in service of the games represents one of history's most morally complex achievements. Roman physicians made genuine advances in surgery, anatomy, and trauma treatment by working on gladiator injuries. They learned to repair wounds, reset bones, and keep fighters alive long enough to return to the arena. This knowledge undoubtedly saved lives beyond the gladiator schools, yet it was gained through the systematic brutalization of thousands of human beings. Perhaps most tragically, the gladiator system created its own justification through the very resilience it demanded from its victims. The fact that some gladiators survived, even thrived, was pointed to as evidence that the system was not as cruel as critics claimed. Look, the apologists would say, see how strong they become, see how they embrace their fate, see how they find honor in the arena. This twisted logic ignored the countless who died in training, who broke under the psychological pressure, who chose suicide over continued participation in their own degradation. The gladiators who achieved fame and fortune within this system faced perhaps the cruelest irony of all. Their success made them symbols of what the system could offer, living advertisements for the supposed nobility of the arena. Yet they knew better than anyone the true cost of their achievements. They had watched friends die for the amusement of strangers, had killed men they respected for no greater purpose than spectacle, had traded their humanity for the fleeting approval of crowds who would forget their names before the day was done. The end, when it came, was rarely clean or noble. Age claimed some, their reflexes finally too slow, their bodies too broken to continue the charade. Others died in the sand, not in glorious single combat, but exhausted, overwhelmed, their famous skills finally insufficient against younger, hungrier opponents. A few achieved the ultimate prize, the wooden sword that symbolized freedom, only to discover that they no longer knew how to live outside the arena's brutal certainties. The gladiator's death was as choreographed as his life had been. The crowd demanded a good show even in dying, and the fighter was expected to provide it. To die well in the arena meant to maintain dignity while being slaughtered for entertainment, to face extinction with composure while surrounded by the cheers of those who had come specifically to witness your destruction. Yet in their final moments, some gladiators transcended the system that had enslaved them. They chose how to die, if not when, and in that choice lay a kernel of freedom that no amount of brutalization could completely extinguish. They faced death not as victims, but as human beings, asserting their final claim to dignity in a world that had systematically stripped away everything else. The legacy of these forgotten warriors extends far beyond the arena's walls. They demonstrated that the human spirit can endure conditions of unimaginable brutality without being completely broken. They showed that bonds of brotherhood can form even in circumstances designed to pit man against man. They proved that dignity can be maintained even when everything else has been taken away. Their story is a mirror held up to our own civilization, forcing us to confront uncomfortable questions about the entertainment we consume, the violence we tolerate, and the systems we allow to flourish in our name. How different are we from the Roman crowds who cheered for blood? How many modern gladiators fight in arenas we prefer not to see? Their suffering transformed into profit for those who own the means of spectacle. The gladiators faced death daily, not just in the physical sense, but in the spiritual and psychological sense as well. Every day, they awoke knowing that some part of their humanity would be sacrificed on the altar of entertainment. Every night they went to sleep, having survived another small death, another step in the systematic destruction of everything that made them who they were. And yet, they endured. They found ways to be human in the most inhuman circumstances. They created meaning in meaninglessness, forged connections in isolation, and maintained hope in hopelessness. Their story is ultimately not one of victimization, but of the incredible resilience of the human spirit when faced with absolute adversity. As we conclude this examination of their world, we must acknowledge that the gladiators achieved a form of immortality their masters never intended. They live on not as symbols of Roman power or efficient brutality, but as testament to the indestructible core of human dignity that no amount of systematic cruelty can completely extinguish. In facing death daily, they taught us how to live. Their voices echo across the centuries, reminding us that every system of oppression contains within it the seeds of its own destruction, that every attempt to reduce human beings to mere objects of entertainment or profit ultimately fails because the human spirit cannot be permanently crushed. The gladiators faced death daily, and in doing so, they achieved a kind of life that their oppressors, for all their power and wealth, could never attain. In the end, the arena claimed their bodies, but it could not claim their souls. And in that failure lies perhaps the most important lesson of all, that human dignity, once awakened, becomes indestructible, and that even in the darkest circumstances, the light of human resilience continues to shine.